All right, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our third installment of Cosmic Coffee. I'm Jeff Hull. I'm an astronomer and the director of Lowell Observatory. We're coming to you live from Flagstaff, Arizona in various points because we're all kind of in our own quarters these days. If you tuned in last Tuesday evening, we had this big supermoon event describing the circumstances of the full moon that evening. And today, we're going to move a little bit into more detail on a topic related to the moon. If you were with us on Tuesday, you saw the Clark telescope, and that has kind of a long history in lunar exploration. And with us here today is a good friend and colleague, Kevin Schindler, Lowell Observatory historian. And he is here to tell us all about what's going on with the moon. But before we start with that, we want to remind everybody we use Cosmic Coffee as a chance to give a little shout out to some local business, in particular our coffee shops. This week we're just giving a shout out to Wicked AZ, available in little places around town, and encouraging everybody to support local business as we sort of struggle. All right, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our third installment of Cosmic Coffee. I'm Jeff Hull. I'm an astronomer and the director of Lowell Observatory. We're coming to you live from Flagstaff, Arizona in various points because we're all kind of in our own quarters these days. And if just a minute, we're having an audio last Tuesday evening, we had this big supermoon event describing the circumstances of the full moon that evening. And today, we're going to move a little bit into more detail on a topic related to the moon. If you were with us on Tuesday, you saw. All right, Kevin, why don't you go ahead? Telescope, and that has kind of a long history.
Okay. Well, it's great to talk about this. I'm sitting from my home here in Flagstaff, kind of at the base of Mars Hill. And I love my location because it's Old Town Flagstaff, but I also live right across the street from where Jack Schmitt was living when he was chosen to be an astronaut. He was working here at USGS in Flagstaff at the time. And so it kind of feels like I'm a little bit tied in with that Apollo history, if we can tie in even more, because there's so much in Flagstaff that had to do with getting to the moon. And so what we thought we'd do today is to talk a little bit about Apollo 13 in particular, and use that in some of what the astronauts for that mission did here in Flagstaff, because we're approaching the 50th anniversary of that mission. It was April 11th in 1970 when Apollo 13 launched. And of course, as most of us know, and it has been popularized in the movie from the 1990s, Apollo 13, they had a major problem that was life or death. It was unclear if they're going to make it back. They never were able to land on the moon. And so all that geology training they did here in Flagstaff didn't help them out much because they didn't land. However, Apollo 14, the next mission, which was commanded by Alan Shepard, the first American in space previously, they landed where Apollo 13 was. And so they did the same training as Apollo 13 and went to a lot of these same places also. So we thought we'd just touch on that a little bit today.
Sounds good. So you have sort of riffed off of this famous statement about Breccia, or we have a problem.
Right.
So tell us about that.
Well, Breccia is a type of rock. And it's a type of rock that's just composed of fragments of other rocks thrown together. And it can be formed in a lot of different ways by, in a river that brings in a lot of large pieces of rock. It can also be created by impact, when an impact from space blasts into a surface, blows a bunch of rock up, the rock falls back together, is fused together, and you have a breccia. Well, Apollo 13 was going to be landing in a place called Fra Mauro, and Fra Mauro is a place that is very rich in these lunar breccias that were created by impacts. And so that's what the name kind of refers to.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess the place to start is why northern Arizona? What brought NASA and the astronauts to this particular area?
Well, let's go back just briefly of why we're even doing space. If we let me go to the next slide here. If we go back to 1961 and 62, we were in the middle of the Cold War with the Russians. They had sent up a satellite in 1957 on October 4th. And that really got our attention as Americans and our American leadership. If the Soviets can send up a satellite, maybe they can spy on us or drop bombs on us, the thinking was. So this really got a lot of attention. They could really take a lead in the Cold War if they keep developing this technology, so we better catch up. And so NASA was created in 1958, and then the first group of astronauts were brought on just to get out into space. But the Soviets kept beating the Americans. They got the first person. They got the first orbit around Earth. They got the first female in space. And so when we finally got our first person in space, Alan Shepard, in 1961, President Kennedy, in working with his advisors, said, okay, I know how we're going to get ahead of the Soviets. We're going to go to the moon by the end of the decade and return safely. Talk about a bold declaration. We've been in space for 15 minutes, and now we're going to go to the moon. So we have to figure out how to fly out there, how to stay alive, how to dock rockets and such. And so this turned into a major national effort. So lots of effort going into developing the technology and such. But then enter the scene those pesky scientists. And one of particular note is the one on the right here, Gene Shoemaker. And Gene Shoemaker was a geologist. And he and other scientists said, if we're going to go to the moon, we should do more than plant the flag, thumb our nose at the Soviets and come back. We should do science. What a great opportunity to do science. We should do geology and pick up rocks and learn about the place. And, in hindsight, imagine if we had gone to the moon and not done the science. What a loss that would have been. So thanks to Gene Shoemaker and others like him, they said, okay, let's do this science. Well, if we're going to do science, who's going to the moon? These are test pilots, fighter jocks. They've all been to college. They're all smart guys, but they don't know anything about geology. When you go there, what rocks do you pick up? How do you interpret the landscape? And so Gene Shoemaker said, okay, if we're going to send, not only should we send astronauts there to do science, we've got to train them on how to do that. And what better place than northern Arizona? And there are other great places on Earth for training, and the astronauts did train in Hawaii and Oregon and New Zealand and other places. But northern Arizona proved to be a really great place because, Shoemaker said, you go to the moon, you're going to see a crater like this. This is Lanai Crater. Well, heck, we have a great analogy right here in northern Arizona, Meteor Crater. So what a great opportunity. Let's bring the astronauts here for training. And so NASA agreed, that sounds like a good idea. We'll do a test and see if that actually is going to be worthwhile or not. And so in 1962, we have the second group of astronauts named the Next Nine. And I love this picture of the Next Nine because, you think about these guys were working 16, 18-hour days quite often. And they were working hard. So it got to where, the harder you work, the harder you have to play in the small amount of time you have. I think just like now during the coronavirus, you need some time away from reality, exercise or something, to keep you a little bit sane. And so I love this picture because in the middle of this hard training, they
got to
be a little bit, okay.
Just a quick input for you. It sounds like Okay, we're going to give this another try. It sounds like the stream is back up and running, as according to Danielle. So, Kevin, maybe what you should do is, I think the audio was pretty good. So just go back through some of the visuals you were talking about and reorient everybody to where we were, and then we'll pick up where we left off.
Sure. And this is reminiscent of Apollo 13 and all the missions. They all have glitches. And the success of these missions was due to the people behind the scenes figuring out the technical details.
That's right.
In Apollo 13, we had mission control. For this cast, we have Danielle Adams heading up efforts. So, there's always what you see up front, but what makes it happen behind the scenes, and those people are really critical. So we started talking about Apollo 13, and the reason we were going to space in the first place goes back to John Kennedy, and he challenged the country to go to the moon and return before the end of the decade in order to beat the Russians. And scientists like Gene Shoemaker, shown on the right here, said, why go there just to beat the Russians? We should do science and bring back rocks and collect rocks. If we're going to do that, we better train the astronauts because they're not trained in geology, being able to look at landscapes and interpret them and know what rocks to pick up. And so Shoemaker said, if we're going to send them and train them, northern Arizona would be a great place to do that, because as the moon has craters such as this, northern Arizona has a similar crater. And as we know now, these craters were formed in the same way, by an impact from a rock from space. Mm-hmm. So what a great place to do this training. And so as the second group of astronauts were being named, and this is where I think we left off, this group was brought in 1962. And just to point out, this is one of the legendary astronaut classes, because we have, Frank Borman, who went to Tucson High School here in Arizona. He flew around the moon. John Young walked on the moon. Tom Stafford flew around the moon. Pete Conrad walked on the moon. Jim Lovell, the star of Apollo 13 and what we're talking about today. Ed White, the first American in space. And I just love this graphic. When we think about astronauts in general, one of the first people we think about is Neil Armstrong. And that one, this one in the upper left, as we're seeing, is Neil Armstrong looking up kind of in a silly way. So I just love this picture of the astronauts. So while these guys are being brought on, Gene Shoemaker and other scientists are talking in NASA and saying, let's bring them out to Arizona to do a test training, to see if it's worth bringing them out here to learn geology. And so in January of 1963, just a few months after they were named astronauts, they came out here. It was January 16th, 1963. It was bitterly cold. The astronauts landed at Flagstaff Airport on two planes because the thinking was, let's not put them all in one plane in case there's an accident. Some of them at least will survive if they're on two planes. That was the thinking they had. So they came out here. They went to the Meteor Crater, and this is Gene Shoemaker with his hand pointed up, and this is Jim Lovell. And again, we're kind of focusing on Apollo 13. In 1963, Jim Lovell had no idea he would be commanding Apollo 13. At this point, the astronauts were just out here to learn basic geology. And he was in that first class to come out here. So they went to Meteor Crater. They went to Sunset Crater because, the moon is volcanic in origin. And so places like Sunset Crater had lava flows and other places that they would expect to find on the moon. So that seemed like a good place to go. And then they came up to this place, which isn't obvious from this picture. This is a house right next to where you live, Jeff, where Dave Sawyer lives now. Back in 1963, it was a brand new house for the director at the time, and it was to welcome these astronauts. Because after going to Meteor Crater and Sunset Crater, they came up to Lowell Observatory because at the time, Lowell was involved in moon mapping. And so the idea was to come up here and teach about the moon mapping that was going on. So let me just digress a little bit. and talk about this moon mapping because it really was an important project. It took place at Lowell from 1961 to 63 and was mostly done by a branch of the Air Force called the Aeronautical Chart and Information Center, the ACIC. And they founded the Clark Telescope, where you were the other night with Brian Skiff, was an ideal place to make these maps. And so they rented that telescope out for years. Now, this wasn't the only lunar mapping being done in Flagstaff. The U.S. Geological Survey was creating geologic maps of the moon, and that really set the stage for their future development because a big effort still today of USGS is mapping solar system bodies. So up at Lowell, this mapping went on. This lady's name is Pat Bridges. And Pat Bridges was a scientific illustrator and just remarkable at what she did. You can see she's making a map using an airbrush. That's what she has in her right hand. And the attention to detail is just magnificent. And she's doing this artwork. And so we had artists working here. And Pat is still alive. She lives in Phoenix and Flagstaff. Another one of those folks who's still alive is Bob Mulfair. Bob lives up in Las Vegas now and sent this picture to us a little while back. He was a photographer with the project. And so what they would do is take the best pictures they had of the moon and then look through the Clark telescope and either look visually through an eyepiece or with a camera, take pictures, wait for those moments of good seeing to get really good images. And then the artists like Pat Bridges would sketch in the details and make these exquisitely detailed maps that just, really boggles the mind when you look at them to think that this is all done by hand. And yet it was so accurate and detailed. The project got so, they did so well with it that we need another telescope. If we have two telescopes, we can do twice the amount of work. And so in 1964, a new telescope was brought from Texas, and this dome still stands at Lowell and is kind of behind our Hendricks Center for Planetary Studies and next to our collection center. So from the back of the visitor center parking lot, this dome is pretty obvious. Inside this dome is this telescope. And I love this picture. We just got it from Terry McCann, one of the moon mappers. And it shows the telescope that was originally in that dome and the moon mappers there being filmed for a documentary here, actually, back in the 60s. So they made dozens of these maps. And then the final project was making a globe. And here's Terry McCann, by the way, the second from the right, and Jay Inge, who took over as the main illustrator and just was a remarkable person there with a couple other colleagues there. They created these what are called gores, these sections that when put together creates the map. So each gore is like the width right here. And so they made these maps. And so this was going on in the 1960s. So when the astronauts came to visit, they came up to Lowell so they could learn about this mapping. Because, earlier in the day, they saw what real lunar features might look like by looking at an analog such as Meteor Crater. At Lowell, they could see how these lunar features are depicted on maps, which would be critical to when they're, figuring out where to land and reading maps and trying to understand their location and such. So here's Pat Bridges, and this is in what was the ACIC office. The original office is no longer there, but the office grew years later. So when you go up to the observatory, the first building on the left is now the business operations building. So that's roughly where they're standing right now. So that's Pete Conrad, who walked on the moon on Apollo 12, next to Pat. And again, that same visit to the right is Tom Stafford, who flew around the moon on Apollo 10, and Neil Armstrong, the first person to land on another world, and astronomer E.C. Slipher. And they're actually looking at a Mars map, but the same techniques to depict features as you would do with the moon. And then, the star of the show, sort of, our future Apollo 13 commander, Jim Lovell, is looking at some pictures of the moon right here. John Young was the backup commander for Apollo 13. Again, this is 1963, this picture. He has no idea he's going to be backing up Apollo 13, but he would go on to become the backup commander. He was part of that second group of astronauts that came up to Flagstaff, and here he is looking at some pictures. So this was really useful for them to see these maps, and we're talking about stuff they did in one day. They went to Meteor Crater, Sunset Crater, went to Lowell, and then after learning about the moon, they split up in 3 groups, because what they wanted to do now was to look through telescopes. They've seen analogs on Earth. They've seen what lunar features are how they're depicted on maps. Now they want to see the real thing through telescopes. And so they split up. Some of them used the Clark telescope up here at Lowell, and this is a modern view of the Clark. Some of them went to the Naval Observatory, and in fact, the Navy guys, which included Jim Lovell and John Young, went out to the Naval Observatory, and then the other 3, including Neil Armstrong, went to Northern Arizona University. And in this picture, the yard art right here is the original telescope that was inside that dome, and that's the telescope that the astronauts look through.
I like the yard art at the Navy too.
Oh, the Navy, if we go back here, we're 7,000 feet, and here's this big ship's anchor here that is a little bit out of place in northern Arizona.
Yep, I think they told me once it was the highest anchor in the United States. So
yeah, I believe it. So, the astronauts found that this was useful. NASA found that this training was useful. And so they decided, let's do more training out here. They, before the astronauts left on that trip, they went to NAU. And again, here's Jim Lovell sitting, looking at a map. Gene Shoemaker, Neil Armstrong. Another legend of Flagstaff science was Art Adel. There's a building on campus called the Adel Mathematics Building named after him. And Pete Conrad and Frank Borman from Tucson. And then to the right is John Young, who would later become the backup commander of Apollo 13. So they realized, this trip, in just less than 24 hours, they were able to really do a lot of training. Pete Conrad, when he was interviewed after this trip, said, NASA has typically found a way to put 26 hours into a 24-hour day. And that's the mode of operation today. And I think the person I'm talking to on this call, he tends to practice that same philosophy. Is that right, Jeff?
Oh, I don't know, 24 and a half maybe. But
yeah, okay.
So this pretty much established the area as sort of the go-to place for training.
Right. And so they, like I said, there's training being done elsewhere, but with the USGS being established here, which Gene Shoemaker did, that became a center of operation for bringing the astronauts here and training them, also for developing the techniques they would use on the moon, the geology reconnaissance, and developing and testing the instruments. You're going to a place with 1/6 gravity. You're going to be wearing this big, bulky suit. And so the geology hammers and the, shovels and rakes and how you collect samples, all that stuff has to be developed specifically for the moon. And so they tested a lot of that stuff out here in Flagstaff. One of the scientists who was really involved with this, his name is Jerry Stauber, shown in the left here. And he's standing after the last mission came back with Jack Schmitt. And Jack Schmitt, we kind of call him Flagstaff's astronaut because he was working at USGS when he was chosen to be an astronaut. And in fact, there's kind of a fun story I always like to ask Jerry to tell, because Jerry is still around, is Jerry went to University of Cincinnati, and this is the mid-'60s, and he went to get interviewed for a job, and one of the guys interviewing him said, okay, come out to Arizona when you're ready. So Jerry got to Arizona and went to the USGS where he got a job, and his boss wasn't there. And turns out his boss was no longer working there. And he asked, why isn't he there anymore? Well, his boss was Jack Schmitt. And in between the time Jerry was hired to work there and he arrived in Flagstaff, Schmitt was named to be an astronaut and had left Flagstaff by that point. So when Jerry got here, he had no boss for a short amount of time. But Jerry's one of the guys that helped lead that training. Excuse me. So, you think about bringing astronauts out here, and like we said before, these guys are test pilots. And some of them were cynical about geology and about science in general. They were engineers. These were great engineering minds, but ones like Frank Borman, who was true blue, thought we should beat the Russians. He said, what does picking up rocks have to do with beating the Russians? Isn't that why we're really going? And of course, the scientists wanted to go to do science. And so the scientists realized, if we're going to inspire these guys to want to learn geology, why not take them to one of the most inspiring geologic landscapes on Earth, the Grand Canyon, which of course is in our backyard. And so all of the astronauts who went to the moon trained in the Grand Canyon, all of them except for one. And the one who didn't was Jack Schmitt. Jack Schmitt was already had his PhD in geology. He didn't need any inspiration. While the astronauts came to northern Arizona to learn geology, Jack Schmitt was learning how to be a pilot so he could fly to the moon. So all of them except Jack Schmitt came here. And the idea was that they would hike into the canyon, look at different layers of rock. And, the rock of the Grand Canyon is not what you're going to find on the moon. There's a lot of sedimentary rocks with fossils. We are pretty sure we weren't going to find any fossils on the moon. The idea, though, is the Grand Canyon is a great laboratory for understanding how geology works. Surveying landscapes and, layers of rock tell stories. They have a history. And so if you can read the layers of rock in a place like the Grand Canyon, you have the mindset and the technology and the terminology to be able to do it anywhere. And so the idea is to hike into the canyon. They would start on the South Kaibab, go down the South Kaibab Trail to the bottom, go to Phantom Ranch, and then come up the next day. So on the way down, they would break up into groups of 2 or 3 astronauts with a geologist per astronaut. And as they go down, they would stop at different spots and learn about, the geologists would instruct them. And then on the way back, the astronauts would be the instructors and see what they remembered. So that was the plan. So they started out at the Yavapai Geology Museum. And again, here is future Apollo 13 commander Jim Lovell, third from the left. And the guy with the hat right next to him will go on to be his backup commander. That's John Young. And Gus Grissom from the Mercury crew. And Wally Schirra, who is a real hot dog ham, is smiling because earlier that day it was his birthday. They gave him a big birthday cake. So he apparently was smiling the entire time. So they get to the edge of the canyon. And these guys, when they go to the moon, they're going to be geologists. So they have to learn to be geologists. They have to play the part. And that means having the right tools. They have John Young holding a geology hammer and Jim Lovell with his field notebook. And you see with John Young, he's got his Brunton compass to measure the strike and dip of rocks. And he's got map cases and such. So these guys, they're going to learn to be geologists. And they really ended up getting like a master's degree in geology, the equivalent with what they learned. So they hiked into the canyon. Here's a picture of them at the bottom. There's Lovell is right in the middle again. They hiked down, spent the night at Phantom Ranch, and then hiked back up. And most of the astronauts looked back and said, that was really useful. It's Neil Armstrong said, that's when I really got it. That's when I really understood the value of geology and being able to just look around and understand the landscape. So that turned out to be a really useful exercise for them. So this training is going on for several years. They first arrived in 1963, the astronauts, and all of the moonbound astronauts came here to do basic geology, to learn how to read rocks and such. As the 1960s progressed, we have the Gemini missions, and then we start the Apollo missions in the late 60s. And as we got to that point, we have missions being defined, and then we have specific astronauts being assigned to each mission. And that's when the geology training went from generically learning about geology to specialized training. If we're going to this section of the moon, let's study this kind of rock that we expect to find there. For later missions, they're going to use a rover to drive around. So let's use a practice rover to drive around the geology fields. I think one of the cool things they did was look at the topography, and they said, okay, we have Meteor Crater, which is a great analog to craters on the moon, but we want the astronauts to train in a place, a topography like that of the moon, which means not just one crater, but a lot of craters. And so let's create a field that has dozens or hundreds of craters, just like a typical place they'll land on the moon. And so in the late 60s, 68, 67, 68, USGS created 3 different crater fields, 2 in northern Arizona, right by the Cinder Hills landfill in Flagstaff. And then they found when it snowed in Flagstaff, we had a really good snow back in 68, 69. Craters were full of snow. So they built another crater field down by Cottonwood. And this is a picture of them blowing up that crater field. And they had a picture of an area on the moon. And then they painstakingly made a grid, measured it out in this field, and then dug holes at different depths and put a different amount of explosives in these to create different size craters. And they created this crater field. And so after the Apollo 13 mission was established and the crew was assigned, Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes, who would be the 2 walking on the moon, they came out here to train specifically for their mission, as did their backup crew, John Young and Charlie Duke. And so here's a picture of Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes at that crater field. And this picture is only a few weeks before their mission. This was some of the last geology training they did, was a final mock-up at the crater field in which they worked with Mission Control. They were radioing back to Mission Control, so it was a complete practice, not just for the astronauts to figure out what they would, or to practice what they would be doing, but to radio communications back to Houston. And in fact, this contraption in the middle was called the Modularized Equipment Transporter, another great acronym, MET, because who's going to remember that? The astronauts just called it the golf cart or the rickshaw. And, the first missions, Apollo 11 and 12, the astronauts just walked around, but you can only carry so much. In later missions, they used a rover so they could drive around and carry a lot of equipment, and tools, and rocks. Until they had those rovers, they had this modularized equipment transporter. It had 2 wheels, so you would put stuff in it, then lift it and pull it around. So here's Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes practicing with that. And then their backup crew, John Young and Charlie Duke, down in Cottonwood doing the same thing.
So those artificial crater fields are still pretty much intact, are they not?
They are. The ones here in Flagstaff are made in the middle of the cinder field, the remnants of the Sunset Crater explosion, and they're exceptionally well preserved considering it's 50 years old. In fact, the first field they made was just recently included in a registered landmark site that's been approved.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be the Forest Service is developing some historic signage and trails and other things that will be going back there. This field in Cottonwood is sort of still there. For years, it was believed to have been obliterated and covered by a housing project. It turns out that's not true, but it's in the middle of an alluvial field. Water floods through a lot, and so the craters have been filled up with mud. And so on aerial views of the site, you can kind of see the craters, but if you go there in person, which I've been there a few times, the easiest way to see the craters is you'll see a circle of trees where seeds fell into those craters long ago and leave this circular area.
Okay.
Those crater fields are still there. And so, this training they did in northern Arizona, like for all the missions, it really proved successful because it got them to better understand geology. And I think, an important thing with this, Jeff, is, I like history, and I like the history of Lowell and Flagstaff because it's such a great heritage. But the reason I like it so much is that this is the foundation for the future. We think about Lowell Observatory, for instance. We've been around for more than 125 years, and we celebrate Pluto's discovery and the discovery of the first evidence of the expanding universe and astronaut training and such. Mm-hmm. But that's the foundation for what's still to come. With the Lowell Discovery Telescope, what are we going to be talking about down the road? It's really exciting to think about.
Yeah, we were talking a bit about that Tuesday night. I think there was a question from one of the viewers, what kind of things are we going to be using 50 years from now? And looking at the difference between what they were using back then and what we have now, it's the sky's the limit, literally, as to what we'll be using in the future.
It is, and we wouldn't be here today without what was done 50 years ago. The old saying, if we see further, it's because we stand on the shoulders of giants. It really is true when we look at this stuff. So in this case, this is a picture of the astronauts doing classroom training back in the 60s, and then they would do field training. Well, this stuff is still happening in northern Arizona. Astronauts, this is the current class of NASA astronauts, and the young lady here, his name is Lauren Edgar, and she's a geologist at USGS, and she's involved as we speak. I mean, not on this very day, but over the last couple of years, she's been involved with classroom training of the astronauts and then taking them out into the field in some of the same areas in northern Arizona where the Apollo astronauts went. And so, again, this is not just a cool historic footnote that happened 50 years ago. It set the stage for what's happening today.
So what we would call our lunar legacy, which you're quite familiar with.
It is, and that's what we've celebrated over 18 months in Flagstaff. The fact that every astronaut who went to the moon trained here in northern Arizona, and it's something we should celebrate. It's a heritage that helps cement Flagstaff's place as a center in the world for doing world-class research, and it continues today. So this lunar legacy is certainly a big part of Flagstaff science. And I think just to close kind of this discussion, like we're talking about the past helping lay the grounds for the future. One of the things we have going up at Lowell that just opened last October and is the beginning of the future of stargazing in northern Arizona and really across the world is the Giovanni Open Deck Observatory. And last year for the Festival of Science, Charlie Duke, who was the backup lunar module pilot for Apollo 13 and was on Apollo 16, walked on the moon, he and his wife were here at a big event we had right before the observatory opened. They were here, they're right in the middle here, to help celebrate this. And this picture is great because you start looking closely, we have Jeff, you're standing right next to Flagstaff, or Coral Evans, and it's just a wide spread of Flagstaff community, and that's so typical of science in Northern Arizona. We have scientists, we have educators, we have media people, and so on. And
there's such a critical mass of science in Flagstaff when you consider Lowell and the Navy and NAU and USGS, but then, very relevant to current day events, TGen North and all the work on pathogens that goes on up here. It's an amazingly scientific community to live in and just a wonderful place to be.
And I think, what we talk about with, the astronaut training and Flagstaff being a center for that, we go back to the 60s with all the turmoil and the country falling apart with civil unrest and the Vietnam War and so many things going on. Apollo was something that so many people could rally around, even if briefly. It was a shining moment. And we think about how many people were involved to make it happen. And we think that Flagstaff was a center for making that happen. One of our species' greatest accomplishments, Flagstaff played a key role. And as you said, current events going on now with coronavirus, trying to solve, that coronavirus and understand it and come up with remedies for it and such. Flagstaff is the center for that.
Yeah, we have world experts. Yeah, there are world experts locally. In fact, maybe some of you, I think our very first live stream was with Dr. Dave Engelthaler talking about the COVID-19 situation. That was back on March 18th or so. So we do have at least one question coming in, and I would certainly encourage viewers, if you have questions for Kevin, you can type them into the chat feed on YouTube. And so one person asked, was that a laptop computer or metal notebook that one of the astronauts was holding up there at the Grand Canyon?
Yeah, we're in between the stages of old tablets with of the Stone Age. That was a metal case for carrying maps. Yep. That it was showing there. Yeah, we look a little bit different today. Today, they'll probably have the iPads.
I think the laptops of the day would have been a little hard to carry.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think the electric cord would have been a little bit difficult to pull off there. And we're talking about Apollo 13 here. This talk kind of centers around Apollo 13.
Yeah.
And what we've done in looking at this geology training is kind of use an example, some of Apollo 13 astronauts here. But that mission, we know about it because of the movie, because of Hollywood. And the movie was, is fairly accurate. They Hollywoodized it some. But it really does, again, reinforce the idea that, in almost any great success, there's always somebody at the pinnacle who you associate with it, whether it's a sports team or going to the moon or, an orchestra. You look at the conductor. But then there's all of the people behind the scene to make it happen. And heck, that's how science is done, that's for sure. Jeff, you can certainly speak to that.
Oh, great, yeah.
You talk about a discovery like, Phil Massey, you talked to him last week about Betelgeuse. But you think about the telescope operators and so many other people that are involved to make something like that happen.
Oh, absolutely. I remember all the way back to doing my thesis observing at Kitt Peak, which was in the late Cretaceous, I think, at this point. But I think the one person I remember the most from that trip was the telescope operator, who was just there every night and knew the facility inside and out and just made it completely work. So yeah, these folks are important. Questions, a couple of questions coming in. Do the astronauts in training still go to the Grand Canyon? Someone would like to know.
The astronauts, there's no formal training at the Grand Canyon. The last trip out here, well, not the last trip, but one of the last trips was last September. And I think some of the astronauts kind of had some free time to drive up there and see it quickly, but they're not doing formal training at this point. They are training around Sunset Crater and Babbitt Ranches and some other areas like that. similar to where some of the astronauts went.
Okay, and Tamara would like to know where are the test craters exactly, the ones up here near Flagstaff?
Well, I could if Tamara, we could get your contact information offline. I could email you some directions. But roughly, both sites are located on Forest Service land, so it's open to the public. Field 1, the first one they created, is fenced off. It's on the southeast side of the Flagstaff landfill, Cinder Hill landfill. And getting to that one is a little tricky if you don't know where to go. Field 2 is a lot easier to find because it's smack in the middle of the Cinder Hill OHV area, which is a big field where people, it's funny, back in the 60s, the later Apollo astronauts tested the rovers out there. And today, people, modern rovers with dune buggies drive around those fields and go up and down in those craters, and quite often have no idea that that's where astronauts trained. And so if you use, if you have a smartphone and get the satellite view and bring up the area around the landfill, you can see these craters on your satellite phone, on the satellite view. So to get to Field 2, you go back to the Cinder Hills OHV area. And once you get, it's just kind of an area with a little kiosk. And then there's a big open field. You go back maybe quarter to half mile, and you start seeing some of these craters. They're really worn down from all the dune buggies, but you can still see a lot of them.
All right, thanks for the question. I'm going to toss it over to Danielle behind the scenes and see if there are any other questions. Oh, yes, question from Florence. Noticed ashtrays and Coke on the lunch table. Were the astronauts practicing any nutritional guidelines during that?
Florence, that's a great question. I mean, some of the astronauts smoked, I guess, and they certainly, like we said before, when they weren't working, they worked hard and they played hard. So there was probably a certain level of alcohol consumption and such. In terms of diet, I don't know. It was probably like people who work hard today, quite often you come under convenience eating and suck down whatever's on the table. Up at Lowell Observatory, we have a community table, and stuff that if it shows up there, it's taken. And when food goes there, it's like the vultures sense it. Before an email goes out. They're there. I suspect the astronauts were the same way.
Yeah, you can't get the email sent. Of course, the community food table is kind of shut down at this point, as is the whole campus. But yeah, it's amusing. The free food emails go out, and it's just bam, it disappears. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, then I think what we'll do at this point is say thank you for joining us. Thanks very much, Kevin, for a great talk about an ongoing legacy, and we're always very excited to see what happens day by day scientifically in Flagstaff. There's so much going on here that we know it's going to be a vital and relevant place for decades to come. So until next week for Cosmic Coffee number 4, thanks for joining us, and we will see